All right, greetings everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Davis, Mr. Davis Musyoki. I'll be your moderator for the day. And of course, at some point, I will have my colleague, Dr. Leila, coming. Please feel free to interact with us to utilize the features of this platform. For starters, if you we have interpretation. At the bottom side of your screen, you will see the interpretation mark. Please click there. If you want to remain on the English channel, the French, or the Portuguese, please be able to you'll be able to do that when you switch around that. So we're just going to give ourselves one more minute to ensure that we are all systems go. If you're able to give me a thumbs up to ensure that you're good, and we can start. We'll be starting in a few. Utilize the features on this of this platform, the reaction button, the chat session, so that we are moving together. We will have an opportunity to do the question and answer towards the end of this webinar. Great. I can see a great number of us are good to go. Great. So for now, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Liana Tindesako, who is an associate research scientist at the African Population and Health Research Center. She sits within the Human Development and with doctorates in gender and diversity studies and curriculum and instruction. Her expertise spans education research, policy analysis, teacher development, gender and inclusion, youth well-being and knowledge translation, with a strong focus on locally led research systems, inclusive education, refugee, school-based mental health, and gender transformative approaches that strengthen African research ecosystem and connect evidence to action. Dr. Lydia, if you can hear me, please, the floor is yours. Feel free to give us the opening remarks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Davis. I take this pleasure to welcome you to this webinar that we've titled Localizing Education Research for Equity and Inclusion from Evidence to Action. I welcome partners, researchers, policy actors, funders, educators, learners, parents, and everybody in their capacity. This is a webinar that has been organized by the African Population and Health Research Center in partnership with Education Sub-Saharan Africa and with funding from IDRC, which is the International Development Research Center. The webinar is based on the work we have done over the year, where we have done research that informs localizing of education research in Africa, as the title is. And the purpose of this webinar really is to reflect, to provide a platform for us to critically reflect on how education research can become more locally owned, more inclusive, and more responsive to the local needs of people within Africa. This is important for us because we know that these conversations then inform the work that we do within education. We're also aware that that research is never neutral, that there's always an agenda that is behind it. And so this is an opportunity to reflect on this knowledge, and we are aware that these reflections which is a program play research we do. We talk about teacher professional development. Okay, for example, we want to introduce social and emotional into teacher education. That again is informed by what we do. So what I'm saying is that the research we do, oh my God.
Great. Apologies for that. I think we have slight technical glitch from Dr. Lydia's side, but nevertheless, I think we have all captured the essence of this webinar. And as I do that, Dr. Lydia will still come when we set a connection. I want to see if Dr. Moses Ngware, our first presenter, is on the call. Yeah, can see Dr. Moses. So Dr. Moses Ngware is our second presenter. He will be talking about what do we mean by localizing education research and why does it matter? So Dr. Moses Ngware is the theme lead of the Human Development and head of the Education and Youth Empowerment Unit at the African Population and Health Research Center, with over 20 years of experience in education and youth empowerment research across sub-Saharan Africa. His work focuses on education systems, classroom practices, skills training, and impact evaluations that inform policies to improve learning outcomes and strengthen education intervention. Dr. Moses, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, moderator. Thank you, Davis. Sorry, Lydia, for the connectivity. We are happy that you are back. So thank you for the invitation to speak here, Davis. And I'm happy because today we are having a conversation on localizing education research in Africa for equity and inclusion. As Davis saying, my name is Moses Ngware. But then, going back to the question that the moderator asked, what do we mean by localizing education research and why does it matter? So in other quarters, we use the term decolonizing education research. Excuse me. Not everyone likes that terminology, but nevertheless, I think is a correct terminology. So in the context of today's webinar, I will make 3 observations on each of the 2 questions, starting with what comes into mind when I hear localizing education research. So there are many things that come into mind, but allow me to share 3 of them. One is education research agenda is locally generated. And by this, I mean the communities are involved in shaping that agenda. The local policy actors are involved in shaping that agenda. So we allow them to define the agenda. So that's one. 2 is what comes into mind is rigorous evidence generation and use are collaboratively led by local researchers and policy actors within the continent, within Africa, so that we don't leave them behind. The work is done collaboratively, and actually they are in the forefront of doing that research, and all using that evidence. And the third one is indigenous African knowledge systems are valued and used in the research process, okay? Especially in solutioning, in looking for solution. And that's why in local parlance, we say, oh, locally led solution. I think we need to be intentional about that. So those are some of the things that come into mind whenever I hear the term localizing education research. Your second part of the question is asking, why does this matter? Why does localizing education research matter? I think the first question I ask myself is, it matters to who? And I see this as to the users, for example, to the knowledge generators or evidence generators, for example, to the funders, to the communities, okay, to the ecosystem. So again, I'll reflect and probably make 3 observations on why I think this matters. One is relevance to the context. And sometimes we say locality. For example, supplying mosquito nets to a strongly patriarchal household, okay, with the infant children or a pregnant mother, does not necessarily mean that they'll have access to those mosquito nets. It doesn't. So when you are using local context, local reality, then we are able and quickly we do understand how those kind of interventions need to happen. Now, the second point is shaping the narrative and telling our story. So we are asking ourselves, why does it matter? Why does localizing education research matter? Yes, shaping the narrative and telling our story. So if you tell your story, then you tell it better. Okay? No distortion. And you let people know the good things you want them to know. See, for example, narratives on publication. When they are being told from outside Africa, the story is different. The narratives on innovation, the narratives on local solutions, okay, on what works within our community, within your community. So, shaping the narrative and telling our story. The third one is inclusion in global decision-making systems, so that the knowledge that we generate is being used at the global decision-making system level to inform some of the things that we do in the continent. Even what gets funded, we inform that. Even who gets funded, we inform that. And that's part of the inclusion in the global decision-making systems. Even how success looks like. Again, that one gets informed by the kind of work and the kind of knowledge that we are generating. Moderator, I go back to you. Thank you very much. Those will be my quick reflections on the question that you asked. Over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Moses, and thank you so much for staying within the allocated time and for setting the pace and giving us background of or whatever we'll be discussing today. At this point, we want now to hear some presentations, and I want to welcome Mr. Stephen Akwa, who is a research officer at the Education Sub-Saharan Africa, where he supports early childhood development initiatives aimed at strengthening research capacity and collaboration among African researchers and policy makers. His work focuses on increasing the visibility and accessibility of locally generated ECD evidence, mapping the regional research landscape, identifying emerging priorities, and advancing equitable and inclusive education systems through research dissemination and systematic reviews under the Localizing Education Research in Africa for Equity and Inclusion project. Mr. Stephen, if you are ready, please share with us some of the key findings on barriers and reforms of localizing education research. I'm going to give you about 15 minutes to do this. So over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Davis. And I say a very good morning, good afternoon to all of us gathered here with the intent of trying to ensure that African research actually goes far and then African research is indeed localized. So like Davis said, I am Stephen Akwa and I'll be sharing some insights that has emerged from an evidence synthesis that was conducted with regards to localizing education research in Africa. So here I'll be presenting on the key findings that came up. So just to add to what Dr. Moses Ngwari had already stated, why do we actually need to localize education research? So evidence shows that Africa is one of the continents that produces fewer research outputs. And for me, I say that the issue is not necessarily about the volume of research, but rather who sets the agenda. Do we have sustainable research systems that prioritize locally led agenda setting? Research in Africa often depends on external donors whose priorities may sometimes misalign with national priorities or local priorities. Also, the issue of chronic underfunding further exacerbates this situation, where most African governments fall short of the African Union's 1% GDP target for research and development. Also, a recent study or report indicates that over 20,000 African researchers have left the continent each year since 1990. So if you look at these trends, you would see that they are gradually coming together or contributing to weakened domestic institutional capacity and limited ownership of research agendas. Hence, the need to build resilient local systems to ensure locally led research in Africa for equity and inclusion. Now, the purpose of this particular synthesis review was to examine the barriers, reforms, and enabling mechanisms for localizing education research in Africa. First, we tried to identify barriers to inclusive, equitable, and gender-responsive education research practices. Then we sought to identify key reforms and promising practices that can build more equally locally owned and inclusive research systems. Then finally, based on the evidence pool that we gathered, we propose an African-centered decolonization framework for education research transformation. Yes, so to achieve these objectives, we employed a systematic literature review following the preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and metadata analysis guidelines as propounded by page 2021. This was done to ensure transparency, reproducibility, and methodological rigor. We focused our search primarily on the African Education Research Database, Sabinet African Journals Online, Google Scholar, and OpenAlex. We complemented these databases with institutional websites data. So we actually searched 9 institutional websites, which includes that of APHRC, ESSA, AAU, which is the Association of African Universities, UNESCO sites for various countries, to actually augment the databases that have already been mentioned. Now, we included studies that were produced between 2015 and January 2026, and our search resulted in over 7,000 records, which, when we put all together, we were able to remove about 3,000 duplicates. Now, upon removing all of these duplicates, we were left with around 4,000 publications, which were screened, reading the abstracts and titles of each publication to actually arrive at 188 studies that met the inclusion criteria. And one will say, what is the inclusion criteria other than the period 2015 to 2026 January? So we focused on African research publications that had the themes of decolonization, equity, inclusion, gender, funding, governance, agenda setting, multi-stakeholder platforms, as well as local education groups. So this formed the criteria for inclusion. Now, the findings. Because I have a limited time, I will be very brief. So first, we found persistent colonial legacies to be a critical issue that militates against inclusive, equitable, and locally led research in Africa. These included coloniality of knowledge, where African scholarship is subordinated to Northern frameworks and theories. We also found that indigenous languages are heavily excluded from academia, and according to one notable source, about 94% of all African journals accepted only English, or like generally where most Africans actually publish. If you look at the data, 94% of African journals accept only English. So the question is, if we being like Africans, we are not able to use our journals to actually project our languages, then what are we trying to achieve? Also, donor funding controls research agendas. That is, reliance on external research financing, which are often structured through short-term project cycles and donor conditionalities that aligns research agendas with external development ideologies rather than nationally determined priorities. So you could see that, can we stay on that slide in a minute? Can we go back a bit? All right, thank you. So just wrapping up on the donor control. So we could see that as Africans, we are saddled with a situation where some funders fund globally interesting or fashionable themes other than what actually matters to the African, just trying to foreground the example that Dr. Mgwari had given. Can we move on now? All right. So the other barriers that we identified were structural and institutional inequalities. So we realized that funding was a critical issue when it comes to African research. Most governments fall short of the 1% gross domestic products research and development targets. We also identified brain drain, as has already been identified at the background, that more African PhDs are currently working outside of Africa than those who are inside. Then we also observed partnership of unequals, where Northern researchers or researchers from the global North mostly set the agendas, control funding, they lead authorship, and most often they are the corresponding authors for studies that revolves around Africa and concerns Africans. We also identified some gender issues where mostly early career women who are also family caregivers add family care to heavier teaching workloads. They receive less mentorship. Some had reported harassment and stereotypes in their work as faculty members. Yeah, can we move on, please? Okay. Now the question is, what actually needs to change? Our study identified 4 key reform areas. 1, epistemic decolonization. As Africans, it is about time we actually reflect on our own philosophies. And here, the research identifies the Ubuntu as one of the indigenous philosophies that as Africans we can uphold and reflect on in our research. We have others like the Sankofa, Osotua, and several others in different local languages. So here the point is, as Africans, we have some valuable knowledge that can serve as the background or the theoretical underpinnings of what we do. We really have to always go back and research these valuable African knowledge and let them form part of what we do as researchers. We also need to embrace linguistic pluralism where African languages can adequately feature in formulation of research ideas, policy, and then dissemination of research, so that it will not always be the case that about 94% of African journals are prioritizing English-only entries. We also need to actually sustain funding mechanisms where we have to beef up our domestic funding, try to ensure legal autonomy of our institutions, and like have seed funding for local priorities and things that concerns Africans. We also realize that capacity building and mentorship is very key if we actually need to localize research in Africa. Now, based on these findings that I have shared for the sake of time, we envision an African-centered decolonization framework as one that constitutes 4 interrelated pillars. So here, as you can see from the chart, you see one of the pillars to be epistemic decolonization, focused on indigenous knowledge systems, linguistic pluralism, African languages as medium, funding, institutional restructuring and equitable partnerships, and then capacity building and mentorship. So these are the 4 core pillars. Now, these pillars, they interrelate to result in what we term as ultimate outcomes, which include critical consciousness and decolonial praxis or knowledge or epistemologies, African knowledge production and global contributions, and sustainable research development and transformed societies. Now, it is also worth noting that epistemic barriers, funding, institutional and structural barriers, as I have already stated, adversely mitigate against these four critical pillars. And when not put in check, they prevent the realization of the ultimate outcomes. So at a glance, this is how we try to conceptualize an African-centered decolonization framework. So always our focus has to be on these four key pillars and ensure that we mitigate against the barriers that can adversely affect them in realizing some ultimate goals. Now we make recommendations for government. As the presentations has already focused on, we encourage governments in Africa to increase research and development spending to at least 1% of their various gross domestic products, with dedicated funds for indigenous epistemologies or research that focuses on indigenous epistemologies. We also encourage governments to enact national language policies for education and research. And for this, I must flag that some countries are actually doing well in terms of national language policies for education. I think across Africa, this is quite evident. But what is lacking is when it comes to research and research dissemination, to what extent are governments trying to come up with policies that will actually project national languages in research? Then strengthening institutional autonomy legally, and then formally recognizing local education groups or multi-stakeholder groups and engage them when formulating policies. All right, we also make recommendations for universities and research institutions where we say that universities and research institutions should actually revise their promotion criteria to value local journals and indigenous methodologies. So if you look at the literature, you could see that most universities actually prioritize publishing in globally indexed journals, like journals that are indexed in the Scopus, the Web of Sciences, and the Dimensions. Whereas when researchers publish in their local journals or institutional-based journals, they are being looked down upon, and most of them actually fail to meet promotion criteria. So here we actually
Stephen, you have about 2 minutes to wind up. Thank you.
Great. We actually entreat universities to put up some structures so that publishing in local journals will be a priority. Please, can we move on? All right, so we also make recommendations for donors, local education groups, researchers, and journals. So here we entreat journals to actually prioritize decolonial special issues. I mean, have special issues on decolonizing education research in Africa to actually propagate the decolonization agenda. I think the rest for donors and LEX have already been said. We can move on. Yes. Now, in order to actually help researchers, I mean, all stakeholders like researchers, institutions, funders, partners, policymakers, and CSOs or local education groups to actualize or action the decolonization agenda, we have proposed a decolonization toolkit such that if you are a researcher, at a glance, you have some items to reflect on to actually check whether what you are doing, you are on the verge of ensuring that African research is being localized and you are actually relying on local epistemologies and other philosophies that actually project Africa to the globe. So this is just an overview. This is something that ESSA and APHRC has developed, and in due course, we will share with all persons here to actually guide us in how we can decolonize African education research. So I would like to touch on a few of the items and what they actually do. So Krista, can we move on to the next slide where I end?
Mr. Stephen, I'm
Here,
afraid we're running out of time.
All right. Now I get 30 seconds to wrap up.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Right. So here we say that in terms of setting research agenda, if you are a researcher or you are a partner or a donor, you can reflect on this item by asking yourself, who defines the research priorities Are communities and local actors meaningfully involved? So you reflect on this at the barest minimum or at the initial part of your study to actually answer this question. Then let me also touch on partnership. Are partnership equitable, transparent, and accountable? And all of these sort of indicators have been put into questions to actually help us as researchers, as funders, partners, and all stakeholders to reflect on these items and ensure that the right thing is done by trying to place African epistemologies and philosophies at the center of what we do in order to actually ensure that African education research is indeed localized and made inclusive and sustainable. Thank you so much, Mr. Davis, for your indulgence.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Stephen, for that insightful and thought-provoking discussion. I know we have a lot that we would like to share or indulge. Please make use of platforms that are the tools that are available on this platform, that is the question and answer, as well as the chat pane. So as I welcome the next speaker, Mr. Josh Moitui, please remember we have interpretation. If you're a French speaker, Portuguese, or English, please make sure that you're on the right channel. So Mr. Josh Moituti is a Policy Engagement Manager at the African Population and Health Research Center, where he leads evidence to policy engagement through strategic policy planning, stakeholder mapping, policy dialogues, and the translation of research into policy-relevant knowledge products. With over 14 years of experience in strategic communications, knowledge management, policy advocacy, and stakeholder engagement across international development organizations. His work supports policy influence, donor visibility, research uptake, and resource mobilization across Africa. So Mr. Moitui is here to talk to us or walk through us the environmental scan insights. Mr. Moitui, if you can hear me, I would like to pass the microphone to you.
Thanks, Davis. I hope you can hear me.
Loud and clear. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining. It's great to see such a turnout. We have about 200 people participating, so that's really great to see. So I'll be presenting the findings of the environmental scan, focusing on Kenya, Mozambique, and Senegal. This scan was conducted to understand how education research is prioritized, financed, coordinated, and even translated to policy action in the country systems. So it was really a system scan of where the influence sits, how evidence moves, what either enables or blocks locally grounded education research from shaping policy. The scan further looked at 5 areas, looking at actors. We looked at funding, coordination, bottlenecks, and evidence use. So across the 3 countries, the scan showed that education research systems are not linear. So these are ecosystems. The ministries, of course, matter, but they're not the only actors. We have research regulators, curriculum bodies, donor coordination groups, as well as pooled funds, civil society, coalitions. We have sector reviews, technical working groups. All these shape evidence, how evidence becomes policy relevant. So the main message from the scan is that localization becomes meaningful only when local evidence is connected to decision-making power. So this presentation, therefore, shares what a scan found, what has been validated so far through the stakeholder engagement that we did, and what these findings mean for moving evidence to action. So in terms of where the scan sits within the LARIA study, you can see on the slide now, the first component was the evidence synthesis, which has already been tackled by Stephen Aqua. The second part is the environmental scan, which is the focus of this presentation. As I mentioned, the scan looks at the broader issues identified in the evidence synthesis and asks, how do these issues operate inside specific country system? So we look at Kenya, Mozambique, Senegal, as three different cases in different governance, financing, and coordination arrangements. Moving on. So the reason why this scan was necessary is because literature gives us strong continental diagnosis, but country systems show us where the real blockages and opportunities sit. So the evidence synthesis shows that Africa contributes to about 2% of global research output, despite the scale of continental education challenges and population. But it also highlights that many African governments fall short of the African Union target of investing in at least 1% of the gross domestic product in research and development. So, these figures, they point to a deeper systemic problem. Low research outputs affects visibility, underinvestment affects institutional capacity, brain drain affects continuity and leadership. But the environment scan then asks a sharper, deeper question. Where do these pressures show up in actual policy, funding, and coordination system? So in Kenya, they show up in the intersection between strong formal institutions, financing gaps, donor coordination, and the research licensing. So Kenya has those strong institutions, but the issue is how the influence moves across them. And in Mozambique, it's a different story, and I'm going to show you more of that as we move along. So where the scan maps, the scan used an ecosystem lens. This means that we did not only ask which institution exists, that will have given us a very limited picture, but we looked at how the influence travels across the system. So the scan mapped 6 connected parts of the education research ecosystem. The first was the governance and actors. These included ministries, statutory actors, research regulators, national research funds, universities, CSOs, and development partners. The second level was funding, looking at how education research is actually financed, including public budgets, national research funds, donor support, and those program envelopes. The third was coordination platforms, and these are the spaces where priorities are discussed and negotiated. And the fourth was evidence translation. This is about how research moves into planning, budgeting, curriculum reform, sector reviews, and public accountability. And the fifth was inclusion and voice. And here we asked whose knowledge is included. Are local research visible? Local researchers visible? Are women and early career researchers and communities and local knowledge, knowledge systems represented? And sixth, we looked at bottlenecks and gatekeeping. This includes research licensing, ethical approvals, procurement, language barriers, weak data systems, and publication incentives. So the output of the scan was therefore, not just a country description. It was a validation agenda. It identified where the desk evidence was strong, where practical influence is needed, and where stakeholder consultation test the difference between those formal mandates and the actual power. Moving on, look at the 3-country system. So the 3-country system have 3 systems logics. So the comparison across the 3 countries revealed that their logics are really totally different. Kenya is best understood as a formal architecture system. We have a very clear institutional architecture around the Ministry of Education, the statutory agencies, research regulators, and the national research funding. The ministry is very central, but the agencies such as the Kenya Institute of Curriculum Development, the Kenya National Examination Council, and the Teacher Service Commission, as well as the National Research Fund, all shape how evidence is produced, approved, financed, and translated into reform. Mozambique, on the other hand, is best understood as a coordination architecture system. The sector plan is important for them, but the real analytical story is the interaction between the Education Strategic Plan of 2020-2019, what they call the FASE, which is a fund, and the local education group, as well as the ministry partner dialogue mechanisms, as well as civil society actors. So this means the influence is likely exercised through coordination, financing structures, not only through the former ministry authority. Senegal, on the other hand, is best understood as a program review architecture system. they have something they call the packet EF, is a major sector program framework, and recurring sector review appears to be important, especially for moments of coordination and performance assessment. So the policy and architecture there is visible, but the research to policy pathway needs some clear tracing. So this cross-country comparison gives us a powerful insight. There is no single localization pathway. So localization must be country-specific and must be grounded in each country's actual system logic. Moving on, we have Kenya. So a deep dive into Kenya, which has a strong architecture and distributed influence. So for Kenya, the scan found a formal architecture, as I mentioned earlier. The Ministry of Education, of course, is the formal anchor of the system. It sits at the center of the education policy, planning standards, coordination. But the scan showed that research uptake does not only depend on the ministry alone. The Kenya Institute of Curriculum Development matters, but curriculum is just one of the important roots of which evidence becomes practice. The Kenya National Examination Council matters because assessment determines what the system measures, really. So the evidence on learning outcomes become influential when it connects to the assessment systems. The Teacher Service Commission matters as well because it's a teacher management and deployment. It shapes whether reforms are implemented in the classrooms. NACOSTI as well matters because it regulates the research, licensing, and ethical requirement, makes it a gatekeeper on who can conduct research, how quickly research can proceed, and what compliance conditions are there. The National Research Fund also matters because it provides a formal national pathway for research financing. If you look at the financing picture, it also matters. Kenya's current sector plan projects a 5-year cost of about 5.02 trillion against a projected budget appropriation of about 3.4 trillion, leaving
Mr. Muntoi, sorry, you do have about 2 minutes to wind up. Thank you.
Okay. That leaves a gap of about 1.5 trillion if development partners commitment are excluded. This means that gap creates a lot of room for external actors to influence which reforms move forward. So the key question for Kenya in the scan is who actually shapes the research in practice? And you look at, there's an interplay of the ministry, KICD, the EDPCG, the funders and technical groups. And all these combined actors play a role. Let's move on to Mozambique, given the time. For Mozambique, coordination is a power center. They present a different system of logic from Kenya. And here the education system is organized around the strategic plan and the Ministry of Education, as well as a local education group. And the financing assumption is that in the sector is that 86% is internal financing and 14% is external financing. So at a glance, it suggests a system that is too strong, domestically anchored, but the scan found that the 14% external contribution can have a very significant influence as well. Moving on to Senegal. The Senegal system is organized around a strong program and review architecture as well, as I mentioned earlier. I think a point to note here is that there are visible platforms and actors that play a very key role. But Senegal's key finding is that if the review cycle, that's where priorities are actually assessed and revised. Then localization depends on whether locally generated research actually is factored within that cycle. So the Senegal case reminds us that a strong program framework is not enough. Evidence must have a pathway into the spaces where decisions are reviewed and adjusted. And as I look at the comparison, if you look at the comparative leverage points of all this, I think the first one, and as was mentioned earlier, is agenda setting. Across all the 3 countries, the scan shows that the formal mandates do not fully explain who sets priorities. And the second one is evidence pathways. Research becomes influential only when it enters the real decision processes. And third is the financing influence. where it shows, the scan shows that money is not neutral. Financing gaps, pooled funds, partner envelopes can shape those technical choices, sequencing, and the implementation speed. And fourth is the civil society voice. The scan identified, important civil society platforms. But the central question is not whether civil society exists. The central question is whether the coalitions are consulted or whether they shape their decisions. I think I will stop there in the interest of time and hand over back to you, Davis. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much. Quite an interesting presentation right there by Mr. Muitui. Thank you very much. I know we will have an opportunity to engage with the questions that are coming through. I can see the chat is actually, very active, introducing yourself and where you're dialing in from. So thank you. And definitely we will share these slides. But before then, I would like to welcome Dr. Amani Karisa, who is an education research under the education researcher, under the Human Development theme at African Population and Health Research Center, and whose work focuses on decolonizing education research and policy in Africa, particularly the influence of power on knowledge production, evidence use, inclusion, and educational reform. His interdisciplinary research spans disability studies, neurodiversity, teacher professional development, universal design for learning or UDL, gender and masculinity studies, indigenous knowledge and community participation, with a strong interest in epistemic justice, marginality, and locally grounded approaches to educational transformation across the continent. Mr. Dr. Karisa, please, the floor is yours. Please share with us the empirical insights and country experiences. And I'm going to give you about 15 to 20 minutes to walk us through this. Thank you.
Thank you, Davis. Yes, colleagues have presented on the desk review on the environmental scan. So we will focus on the primary data, what is coming from the ground. Yes, so my name is Dr. Amani Karisa, as Davis has said, and I work at APHRC. Yeah, so there's an aspect of this study that focuses on getting data from 3 countries, that is Senegal, Mozambique, and Kenya. Currently, we have analyzed the data from Kenya. We are still conducting data collection in Mozambique and Senegal. So when that comes, we will add into what I am about to present. We'll see how it differs, how it reinforces, or what else we can say about this topic. Okay. So I will start with, I think the slide shows an elephant. I'll start with this story that arose in our engagements in the field about an elephant. The presentation will basically focus on how policy-oriented education research is shaped in Kenya, who defines research agendas, and who becomes recognized as legitimate, and what changes may help make research more locally grounded, equitable, and policy responsive. So this is the story I was talking about. So researchers arrived in a rural community to study mosquitoes. Then an elderly woman listened carefully and responded, "We know mosquitoes, but the elephants are destroying our crops. We should address that first." This was not my first time to hear this story, but of course, every time I hear it, it differs in a way that's how knowledge or how communication, happens. Some they add a bit of salt, some they remove things, but there's a common message that comes here in this story. The issue was not that mosquito research was wrong. That was not the issue. The issue was that the agenda was misaligned with what the community considered most urgent. So this story became a useful metaphor for our findings and for the broader question: who decides what counts as the elephant when it comes to education research? Let's proceed, please. So the research questions that guided our primary data collection were three. The first one is, how do colonial legacies continue to shape policy-oriented education research systems in Kenya? The second one was, what barriers constrain equitable and locally grounded knowledge production? And the third is, what emerging practices are supporting more inclusive and policy-relevant research? So these questions allowed us to examine not only structural constraints, but also the possibilities to reform already, that are already emerging within the system, the possibilities for reform that are already emerging. Let's proceed. So the study, here it's a bit about the methodology. So this study adopted a qualitative case study design. As I mentioned, the focus was on Kenya. We engaged 45 participants across the research, policy, and practice interface, including policymakers, researchers, funders, civil society actors, and local education members from local education groups. Yes, so we held 15 key informant interviews and 5 Bantaba dialogues. So what are these Bantabas? These were especially important because they created more collective and less hierarchical discussion spaces where participants could reflect, challenge assumptions, and co-construct meaning together. The Bantaba, it has West African origin. It's more than a focus group. It's not a focus. It's whereby focus groups, sometimes there's a facilitator and the participants. But here we try very much to make the powers, to remove those power dynamics or power relations, to minimize them. So it's like a collective discussion. So this is an aspect of also trying to decolonize even the methodology that we use. Okay, so the analysis of the data combined deductive and inductive thematic approaches informed by some theory. Of course, there's the whole issue of decoloniality. The main concept there is coloniality. And then we also had Ubuntu. I think it has been mentioned by a speaker. And we also have this aspect of third space. Yeah, we'll see how this plays out. I don't want to define them now, but maybe they'll appear as I present the findings. So the first finding is on the agenda setting as epistemic control. Let's proceed, please. Yes, this is what we can call the first theme, agenda setting as epistemic control. This was one of the strongest findings from our study. Participants repeatedly described how research priorities are often shaped before local actors meaningfully engage in the process. One participant, for example, said the donor comes with already predefined ideas of what they want researched. This is important because it shows that coloniality often operates upstream. Power shapes what becomes fundable, what becomes measurable, and what becomes institutionally visible. So participants also describe situations where researchers and organizations end up chasing the money and not our own agenda. So participation may occur. We can say many sub-Saharan African organizations now get funding, but then they don't set the agenda. Often the agenda has already been substantially configured by some other place. So this is why the study frames agenda setting itself as a form of epistemic control. Let's proceed. The other theme is basically on the paradigm shift, reframing the problem. This also came out strongly, and it's maybe our strongest conceptual contribution of the study. When we talk about theory, how are we extending theory? This is one bit that tries to do that. So the dominant framing has often assumed that local knowledge is absent and that the main solution is simply to include more local actors. However, our findings suggest something more nuanced. Locally grounded knowledge is already being actively produced. People are already active on the ground producing this locally grounded knowledge through schools, implementation systems, communities, civil society organizations, and lived experience. I saw a question on the chat on how community-based organizations can be involved. So it speaks to this. It doesn't mean that people are doing nothing, just waiting for research, formal research to inform decisions. Already decisions are being made. Evidence is being used to make decisions. So the problem is not exclusion alone. Exclusion might be there, but that is not the only problem. The problem is epistemic misrecognition. In other words, useful knowledge already exists, but formal research and funding systems may not consistently recognize it as legitimate evidence. So the challenge is not simply bringing people to the table. It is transforming the criteria through which evidence becomes recognized, funded, and influential. Let's proceed. The other theme I want to talk about is on the coloniality of evidence. Participants repeatedly questioned what counts as legitimate evidence within education research systems. One participant said, government uses evidence. It might just not be your evidence. This is one of the most memorable quotes that we got. Government uses evidence. It might just not be your evidence. Another participant explained that implementation reports and internal evidence are frequently dismissed as gray literature. This created a major tension. Evidence may be highly useful in practice while remaining weakly recognized institutionally or in research cycles. So the matrix on the slide that you see illustrates this disconnect. Implementation feedback, community observations, and school-level realities may strongly shape everyday educational decisions, yet they remain low in legitimacy. Meanwhile, highly recognized academic outputs may not always align closely with local policy realities. I think it's very few participants who said they read journal articles, for example. They use other sources of evidence. Yeah, so the challenge is not simply producing evidence, it is changing how evidence becomes recognized and legitimized. This will help address the disconnect between institutional legitimacy and practical usefulness of the evidence. Let's proceed to the next slide, which is on redefining expertise from below. Who is an expert? Basically, that is what participants were trying to talk about. Because research systems misrecognize evidence, they also frequently misrecognize expertise. Participants challenged the assumption that expertise only belongs to individuals with advanced formal qualifications. For example, a participant said, the colonizers have told us that an expert must have a degree, but expertise is the person who has the ability to do that thing. Importantly, this was not a rejection of formal academic expertise. Rather, participants argued that expertise also exists through caregiving experience, implementation practice, local organizing, lived experience, and community problem solving. I think, yeah. So the examples on this slide show expertise emerging from everyday realities. A community funder establishing a local library after observing learner regression during school holidays. A caregiver using lived experience raising an autistic child to train and support others, and a market lady or a gentleman who may have more expertise than the gender expert because they sell their merchandise outside the school environment, outside the school gate. These were examples that came up in our data. So the key point is that expertise is more widely distributed than formal systems often recognize. Let's proceed. From subjects to analysts, the role of learners.
Carissa, you have about 5 minutes. So,
okay. Participants also challenged adult-centered approaches to education research. Too often, learners were were perceived to be treated as primarily respondents, beneficiaries, or passive subjects. However, the participants described examples where learners actively diagnosed educational problems, reshaped school discussions, and proposed alternative solutions. An example was where a learner-centered theater approach was used, and which helped where students interrupted and redirected discussions around exclusion and oppression. Participants explained that learners sometimes generated solutions that were more creative and more impactful than those proposed by adults. So this finding challenges research systems that continue speaking for learners without recognizing their capacity to interpret educational realities themselves. Yes, the other slide is on Ubuntu as practical accountability. So Ubuntu basically appeared in the findings less as an abstract philosophy. Sometimes it is a high-level theory, but it was more of a practical demand for reciprocity and accountability. A quote like, after this research, will I get to know the findings, or will I just be a participant? That explains what our participants expected. This meant moving beyond extractive models where researchers collect data, publish, and disappear. Instead, participants viewed legitimate research as that goes back to the community to inform the community, maybe to live a better life or to try other ways of doing things. Yes, and let's proceed. The other slide. The other issue is on third space, whereby it was the case. It was not a case of global north versus global south, west versus east. Sometimes it was like, what can west and east coming together produce or generate? So that is the third space. If west and east meet, what is produced? And this were like it appeared in cases of even the communication. They say, is it a must to use in Kenya, for example, to use only English? Can we use English and Kiswahili in our conversations, when reporting about research? Matters like how can we combine formal schooling with community mentoring systems, and matters like linking modern education with intergenerational knowledge transfer. So localization was not framed as purity or isolation. It emerged as hybrid, contextual, and deeply practical. Let's proceed. I'm about to finish. This is important, the other theme on the material infrastructure of inclusion. We keep on talking about inclusion. We need to reach marginalized or vulnerable or the people who are far away. But how can we make it possible? So it came out very, it was very visible because it needs more, it needs resources. It needs meaningful participation requires transport, accessibility support, translation, childcare or maternity accommodations. This was the gender angle, extended timelines, mentorship, and flexible engagement arrangements. However, many research systems prioritize efficiency, rapid reporting, short timelines, and narrow deliverables. So under these conditions, exclusion is not always incidental. It can be built into the operational design of research itself. So as one participant explained, uniform funding structures are not equitable. So inclusion must be materially resourced, not only rhetorically affirmed. So what are the signals of change? We saw these are fragmented but very feasible. So participants identified things like participatory and community embedded research, which is already happening at some level, multilingual dissemination. I talked about language, proximate partnerships, locally led mentorship systems, and more flexible funding approaches. One example of this locally funding, more flexible funding approaches was this participant who said they give a huge amount of money to an organization, and then they trust the organization to channel this money to wherever they see best. So they do not dictate what happens to this funding. That was a very good example of how we can localize education research. Okay, so the core synthesis, just trying to synthesize all this, what I've said. Useful knowledge is actively produced through implementation systems, schools, communities, and lived experience. However, institutional legitimacy often sits elsewhere, in peer-reviewed journals, in donor templates, in proposal structures, and formal technical frameworks. This creates systemic misalignment. And the issue is not that local evidence does not exist. The issue is that systems of validation, funding, recognition do not consistently treat as authoritative. Yes. So we have some recommendations, but I won't go to the recommendations because I feel like Stephen mentioned some of them already. So we can proceed. We can proceed to focusing on what matters. So I would like to conclude. Let's proceed. The next slide. These are recommendations. Yes, focus on what matters. I would like to conclude by returning to the elephant problem. The task is not simply to introduce localization as a new idea. Local knowledge already exists. Local expertise already exists. Local evidence is already being generated every day through schools, communities, implementation systems, civil society, and lived experience. The challenge is ensuring that this knowledge becomes visible, credible, and consequential within policy systems. Ultimately, we must ensure that the evidence we recognize aligns with the realities we are trying to change. It is time we address the elephants in the room. Thank you. Asante.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Karisa, for such an insightful presentation. I can see it's triggering a lot of reaction across the room. Please keep the questions coming through the question and the Q&A feature, as well as the chat pane. We will be able to answer them towards the end of the webinar. But now to shift a little bit and talk about the practical pathways for localization. From evidence to action, we want to have a panel discussion, and to help us get through this session is Dr. Leila Abdullahi, who is the Director of Research Delivery and Programs at Education Sub-Sahara Africa, with over 20 years of experience leading research, policy, and evidence to action initiatives across Africa. She specializes in evidence-informed decision-making, knowledge translation, and strengthening African-led research and education systems. Dr. Abdullahi has worked extensively with governments, development partners, and research institutions to bridge the gap between evidence generation and policy implementation across education and other development sectors. So, Dr. Leila, if you can hear me, I would like now to pause there and invite you to take us through this panel discussion, as we introduce the discussants. Over to you, Dr. Leila.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Davis. Hope you can hear me clearly. Our dear delegates, welcome for today's session. I want to bring our panelists, our experts. We are humbled to have them. I want to first introduce Professor Jacqueline Nyerere. She's an associate professor of education at Kenyatta University. She has led and contributed to transformative research focused on education system, youth employment, gender equity, and sustainable development. Welcome, Prof. Next in line, we have 5 panelists. As you can see, great experts in the room. We have Professor Florencencio Tumbo. He is an education specialist and currently serves as the head of Central Department for Teachers Training at the Ministry of Education and Human Development in the Institute for Distance Education. He is from Mozambique. And next in the team is Dr. Bruno Yose. He has a PhD in education science and in the Department of Education at the Faculty of Education. He is also a director of the Vision Education Farm, expert and consultant in education, training, and early childhood in Senegal. On board is also Professor Helen Injenga. She is the professor at the University of Nairobi, Department of Educational Communication Technology and Pedagogical Studies. She has vast experience, and she's also part of our board member within ESSA. And last in the group is Dr. Carol Hunja. She's the current Secretary Higher Education in the State Department for Higher Education within the Ministry of Education in Kenya. She's involved in the developmental and implementation of policies, which is pertinent for well-established legal framework in the execution of these core mandates within the Ministry of Education. So welcome our panelists, and to make this session very consultative and very engaging, I will also invite at some time our team members, within the webinar, our guests today. We acknowledge your presence. And we can start with you, Dr. Carol Hunja. Just want to understand, within your perspective, what are the top 2 systemic barriers preventing stakeholders from using locally produced education research? Dr. Carol, hope you can hear me. Okay. All right. Yeah. As Dr. Carol is coming on board, I will ask that same question to Dr. Helen Inyenga. What are the 2 systemic barriers preventing stakeholders from using local produced education? Over to you, Prof.
Thank you, Dr. Lila. I'm really happy to be here. And I thank the presenters who have come before me. They have done quite a good job in being able to unpack some of those systemic barriers. And one of the ones that really has stuck out for me, and I concur, is the issue of the elephant in the room. And in this case, if your research agenda is misaligned with what matters most to policymakers, to researchers, to each and everyone in the ecosystem, definitely there will be no uptake of that research. So the importance of aligning our research agenda to government priorities, in this case, education priorities, perhaps even as outlined in the National Education Sector programs, whatever is of importance to the ministry. So one of the systemic barriers, of course, is misalignment. And second, because you asked me to give only 2, is in regards to being able to take up the research that is already there. So I think the challenge is not being able to appreciate local research and assuming that that research is of lesser value. So the need to now go back and begin valuing our own local funds of knowledge, indigenous knowledge systems, I think, as had already been explained before. And it aligns very well with the idea of coloniality of research and knowledge systems, not appreciating our own and preferring to babysit our brother's child and leaving our own child to starve, in a sense. Thank you, Lila.
Thank you so much, Prof. This is very important in that it's clear that one of the barriers is misalignment. I will come to Prof. Jacqueline. How can we ensure that our work aligns with the government, with other stakeholders, with the community? With your experience, what key secrets can you give to the team members in the webinar today? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leila, and thank you to the presenters, to Stephen, Amani, and Josh for giving us the findings of the study. And I do recognize and also identify with some of the findings from the field. So really, on my part, in terms of research and following up from what Ellen has just mentioned, I think as a researcher, one of the things that hinder our participation and also the use of our research is that even as researchers, the question we need to be asking ourselves, do we trust our knowledge, our local knowledge? Do we acknowledge that it's knowledge that is worth sharing? And also the fact that do we take up the responsibility to share this? So as researchers, sometimes we second guess ourselves. We want to do literature review, see what someone else found who is not African, who is not Kenyan in this case. And this is not just about research. When you look at the whole ecosystem, be it research and the way we think or we have been socialized, we've been socialized to think that we come second best. And I think that's a mindset shift that we need to first have. If, for instance, you went to, I went to a supermarket here in Kenya and I found an item that performs the same one that is made in Kenya and another that is made, let's say, in the UK or the US, which item am I likely to pick from the shelf? I'm not asking everyone to answer, but let us reflect on that. So it is a mindset that also comes to knowledge. Which knowledge is worth sharing, and how much of this really gets to be picked? So the researchers, as researchers, we have a system of first wanting to see what everyone else is doing and not before we look at what we have. We second guess our knowledge. But in terms of how this knowledge can be shared, and what we fail sometimes to do is to have an actual meaningful engagement. So as researchers, there is the bit of engagement. Yes, we've engaged stakeholders, but what is engagement and how different is it from meaningful engagement? So engagement, bringing everyone else to the room, and I think this over time with action research and trying to bring on board as many stakeholders as possible, we've done this by bringing different voices, marginalized voices, to sit in the room. But do you engage just by sitting in one workshop, by sitting in the room? And how do we move beyond just engaging by bringing everyone to the room and ensuring that each voice in the room actually counts? And it's not just from the research point of view, but also all the stakeholders. When I sit in the room with experts in quotes, and one of the presentations here I saw where we said experts are not just people with PhDs or who have a master's degree, but we tend to think as such. And so an expert in the room, a professor in the room, someone with a PhD in the room, sitting with a community representative, for instance, and with a student, the student or the community representative will probably be thinking about, I need to learn from the professor or from the expert. And so that power imbalance sometimes also compromises what eventually comes out as the actual meaningful contribution that then can be picked or can be taken up. So we are trying to move towards engaging, but the engagement, in my opinion, has not get to a level where it's actually meaningful enough to pick all the voices and therefore translates to the policy. Then there's also what constitutes policy uptake. What's the impact of what we do and what would be considered as impactful? What is the volume of impact that will therefore be picked? So a lot of times it's just the quantity, the quality, but also the engagement bit of it that sometimes does not get to the level where it would give that impact. I don't know if that...
Thank you. Thank you, Prof. Quite a very useful conversation. I mean, given us some great insight. Most importantly, we need to engage in a meaningful manner. I want to bring Professor Florencencio as a researcher in this space. How do you ensure meaningful engagement to ensure uptake during your research process? And I believe you'll be speaking in Portuguese, but we have the translation for those who need it. Thank you. Please, Professor. Okay, so as Prof is coming in, we can come to you, Dr. Bruno. Similarly, for that question, please, if you can take up as a researcher, how do you ensure meaningful engagement to ensure the uptake? of your work. Okay, I hope you can hear my side. I hope it's not on my side. We can't hear you, Bruno. Can you hear us?
Hello?
Yes, please. Proceed.
Hello?
Yes.
Sou Florescêncio Tumbo. A minha experiência por partilhar aqui, que tem a ver com as evidências, a ação, caminhos práticos para a localização da pesquisa educacional. Não sei se conseguem mover. Não sei se conseguem mover para continuar. Conseguem ver os slides? Não sei. Também
Yes,
conseguem
we
ver.
can hear you properly. Dr. Bruno, it is Professor Florescencio talking.
Ok. Posso avançar?
Yes, please, proceed.
Ok. Thank you very much. Bom, sou Florescêncio Tumbo, já dizia a professora Laila, trabalhei no Ministério da Educação até ano 2024, atualmente sou professor na Universidade Eduardo Mondlane e trabalhando lá na área de psicologia e psicopedagogia também. E em termos de alguma estrutura que organizei, há uma linha introdutória, evidenciação, principais desafios, recomendações, considerações finais. Vou correndo um pouquinho. Dizer que esta discussão tem a ver com a pesquisa que é feita ao nível de contexto africano, em particular aqui em Moçambique, e procurei me basear com a lei do ensino superior daqui de Moçambique, a lei 1/2023,
Professor Florescencio, if you can hear us, it's not a presentation, rather it's a panel discussion to briefly give us what's your experience on engaging meaningfully with the stakeholders you have had experience with to ensure research uptake is optimal. Professor?
Okay. Thank you very much.
Brief as much as you can, please. Thank you.
Bom, dizer que a atividade de pesquisa e investigação cá em Moçambique tem sido desenvolvida e temos tido principais sucessos em termos de alguma divulgação de artigos, capítulos de livros e alguns livros como resultado desta pesquisa. Em termos de alguns desafios que nós temos, que eu julgo que estão associados aos aspectos decoloniais, estão associados, sim, a uma matriz positivista, a algumas pesquisas do âmbito qualitativo, ainda enfrentam algumas dificuldades para serem aceitas em alguns contextos, o que chama a atenção que tem que se desenvolver mais atividades de pesquisa e de investigação, a socialização dos próprios investigadores. Quando entro na questão também de recursos, há déficit ou dificuldades em patrocinar recursos para os investigadores poderem divulgar as suas pesquisas, participarem de alguns fóruns ao nível da nossa África Austral. E uma das saídas que eu vejo é que, enquanto não se patrocinar as atividades de investigação, os pesquisadores devem estar associados a algumas organizações, a alguns grupos de pesquisa, para continuar a divulgar os seus escritos por via de webinars, entre outros encontros virtuais, que eu acho que é possível, e não estarmos a reclamar porque não há um patrocinador em termos de recursos. Bom, essas são as linhas que eu, por enquanto, posso aqui trazer, que há alguns desafios, mas esses desafios podemos internamente trazer uma proposta de solução, mas que a nota que fica é que temos que abandonar os paradigmas decoloniais com uma visão behaviorista, uma visão de quantificação da aprendizagem, o que faz com que muitos investigadores que seguem a perspectiva, esse paradigma de quantificação da aprendizagem, perdem o desafio, não é? Perdem os elementos que estão por detrás aqui do processo, que são valorizados. Eu iria convidar a muitos pesquisadores para abraçarem a perspectiva construtivista. Então, por agora é isso. Obrigado.
Thank you. Thank you, Prof. Florencio, thank you so much. This is quite insightful. The key message I've heard you mention is collaboration, and we should not work in silos. And I want to give the same conversation to Dr. Bruno. How do you ensure when working on your research as early career researchers, how do you ensure collaboration? Because as mentioned, the knowledge from the community, from other key stakeholders, working in an institution, collaborating with the team is very critical. Maybe you can give a word or two from your experience on that. Dr. Bruno, please. Hope you can hear. We can't hear. I hope I'm not the only one. We can't hear. And I see you're not muted, so I'm not sure what's the problem. Okay. Let's see how to solve it, Dr. Bruno. We still can't hear. Anybody else? Davis, confirm, please, that you cannot hear.
Yes, I cannot hear. Perhaps, Dr. Bruno, you can log off and then back in.
All right, thank you. As Bruno is coming back on board, I want to see if Dr. Caroline is around. And I have a conversation with you. I wanted you to add, is Dr. Caroline around? Let's confirm first. The internet has not favored us today. I mean, partly. But yes, we are okay. So we can go back. I want to open the floor to the panelists. Dr. Bruno, let me know if you can hear, if you're able to talk, then I can come back to you. I want to open the floor to the panel, our audience within the webinar for some insight. I saw a message earlier. What does inclusion in education mean? In that, with specific example, we need to bring on board a special group like disability within this kind of conversation. I want to pass this question literally to Professor Helen with experience from such a great space. What's your take on that in ensuring inclusivity? Over, Prof.
Thank you, Lila. I can look at inclusivity at two levels. In terms of research, do we have the researchers that is more inclusive, on the composition of researchers? So do we have female researchers? And I think that came out in our research today, the importance of also enhancing the capacity of women to participate in research, but also people who are in vulnerable contexts. And I think, again, from the research, there was information about the voices of children who many times are invisible from research. So really creating agency where the traditionally marginalized populations in research, like children, women, and people in vulnerable contexts, and those who have indigenous knowledge systems, to me, inclusivity would mean making their voice visible, giving them space to tell the stories from their own perspective would be one of the ways. And secondly, in terms of the research conduct itself, I have done some work where we had to adapt our materials and resources so that we can get data, for example, from children with visual impairment, from children who have hearing impairment. In the past, in early grade reading assessments, those children were missing their data, their performance, their benchmarks were missing, but we have had affirmative actions where now we have data and benchmarks on at least those two types of disabilities. So that is just one of the ways we could do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. And I see a lot of great claps and reaction. That is very important in that we ensure inclusivity. And we saw in the finding, women are quite less in this space. So we need also to ensure in all aspects. This is going to Professor Jacqueline. It has been mentioned in the finding that funding is an issue. Funding model remains short, competitive, and most of the time northern-led. How do you foresee change? If there is, I'm sure even there's already change from your experience. How do you foresee change? What has changed in the space to ensure funding is sustainable? Over.
That's now the elephant in the room. I know the elephant has been used here, but now funding, when it comes to funding and the agenda and what really gets to be recognized as a researchable idea, as outcomes that are supposed to be recognized, a lot of times is defined by who really funds these. So as researchers, over time, we've followed the funding calls for proposal. And when you put out a call for proposal, already you have an agenda. You want to achieve something. So what about the researcher on the other end? So that has really shaped, over time, that has shaped the space in terms of what really gets to be researched on, who gets to be recognized for that kind of research. And so as much as we say the African voices are missing from the space, it's ideally linked, even if we don't want to say it loudly, it's actually linked to the funding aspect. When we talk about our funding influencing policy and practice or not, a lot of times it's also due to the funding. If I have very little funding, I'm funding my own research, I'll probably do very small bit of research, and this cannot necessarily inform a policy at that level. So there are there are of course a number of challenges that come with funding. And when you ask about if the space is changing, perhaps very, very slowly, and I would reference the APHRC, the Harnessing Education Research for Impact in Africa platform, which is now really trying to tilt this so that then we have education that is led by Africans for Africans and to respond to the challenges of Africa. So it is a pool that brings together different actors, government, universities, researchers in different spheres, but also the non-governmental organizations and funders or development partners in all this space, to try to see how do we craft our own agenda that then, so that funding does not necessarily influence the agenda, but the agenda influences that funding. So I would say the example of Harry and conversations that are now going around in terms of what we need to do. But what we really haven't achieved, or where the gap that still remains and which might take time to fill, is that as much as we say all this, we want to lead research and all this, if we do not put in our resources as Africans, the organizations in Africa, governments, African governments, then we still need to fill that gap by getting funding from wherever the source, and that source might still be a challenge in terms of defining the agenda. So I would say yes, it's changing. At least we are conversing around this. Even the fact that we have this sitting and the conversations around this is because we all recognize the need to have to lead this and to take forward some of the priorities that we have as Africans in this space. What remains, and what I may not answer to, I hope, I wish government was here in this room, is how much are governments willing to put in so that then we push this forward. So the changes from the conversations we are having, the recognition that we actually have something to offer, the recognition that we have capacities and we can lead our own narratives. The funding bit of it is now where the challenge still remains, but I believe that probably with the conversations and with the input from research and informing policy towards this end, then funding can actually tilt. So yes, there is change, but it's slow in my opinion.
Right, thank you so much. Prof, it's good to know that the change is happening. At what level? We cannot quantify at the moment, but I mean, we can see some evidence. But the key message is we need to contribute. We means at all level where we are. It could be at the government level. We had Dr. Caroline on board. I'm not sure she's around, but it will be good to hear from her. Nevertheless, I want I'm not sure Elio on board. Help us to unmute one of the participants. Who's that?
Dr. Bruno.
I think Dr. Bruno
Est-ce que
is.
vous m'entendez?
Okay, Dr. Bruno is back.
Allô?
Thank you. Yes, can you hear us, Dr. Bruno?
Allô? Oui, allô,
Yes.
allô, allô. Oui, je vous entends parfaitement. Est-ce que vous m'entendez? Je vous
Yes, we
entends. Est-ce
can
que
hear
vous
you very
m'entendez? Je
well
vous
now.
entends 5 sur 5.
Thank you, Bruno. Maybe you can go back to the question that I asked, if you
Voilà.
remember.
OK. Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup. En tout cas, toutes mes excuses pour ce problème technique, indépendamment de ma volonté. Donc, c'est avec un grand plaisir donc, que je veux partager, d'abord revenir sur la première question concernant mon expérience en tant que jeune chercheur, ancien de l'éducation et spécialiste de la petite enfance. Donc, pour moi, le premier obstacle était donc dans cette articulation encore faible entre la recherche, les décideurs et les acteurs de terrain. Comme vous l'avez dit tout à l'heure, aujourd'hui, la recherche doit être dans une dimension collaborative, c'est-à-dire inclure les enseignants, la famille, la communauté, les jeunes décideurs. Donc, tous doivent tourner autour donc, de cette question qui est la question éducative. Et c'est ce qui même motive les partenaires à mettre la main dans ce projet éducatif. Donc, nous devons passer donc, de cette vision verticale vers une recherche donc, pour promouvoir la co-construction donc, du savoir. Et malheureusement, le constat, c'est qu'aujourd'hui, beaucoup de recherches dans nos universités ne sont pas suffisamment mobilisées dans les processus de réforme éducative et d'amélioration concrète des apprentissages et des contraintes structurelles comme nous le savons. Mais aujourd'hui, la recherche scientifique localisée en Afrique doit répondre aux enjeux de transformation économique et sociale en prenant en compte les réalités socio-économiques de nos pays.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bruno. You have basically tried to handle some of the problem. I mean, the elephant in the room. We want to publish, but where do we publish? We cannot talk about localization while we are banking on publishing our great resources in journals that we have no access to at the end of the day. Ellie, please help me unmute one of the delegates in the room. I would like to hear some voices from the floor. If you have a great experience, sometimes not only question, we'd like also to hear experiences, how you have solved problems. That will be great.
Okay, so we have Rose Opio. Please go ahead.
Please proceed, Rose.
Thank you so much, our great presenters and facilitators. I've really learned a lot. I'm so happy to see my professors there. And thank you, everybody, for this wonderful webinar. So I just have a few questions, just two. One, I do totally agree that the idea of meaningful engagement is very important. And I also believe that a meaningful engagement needs equal partnerships and inclusive voices. And I think Professor Jacqueline mentioned it. So I keep on wondering, like we keep on talking about, we really need to have meaningful engagement. When we are on the table, we need to really be equal partners. How is Africa going to have this equal partnership while its GDP for research is still minimal? So that is something that really disturbs me. And then the other one is, somebody one presenter talked about how we are socialized. I know very well that when we go to communities, I have had that opportunity to be in the communities, to do research with communities. But whenever you get there, our positionality just automatically presents itself. You are presented as an expert, and everything, however much you open the space for their voices to come out, they want to believe that you are the experts. And that power dynamic really keeps on coming back. And especially at the policy level and even at communities, you still are expected to stand at that tower of an expert. So how do you position yourself when you are working with the communities who are socialized to understand that a researcher, an expert is coming to us in the community and should have everything possible to tell us?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rose. So I will take one more question, but just to note, Professor Jacqueline, the first question, and then the second question will go to Professor Florence. So just to take note of it, and we'll take one more, then we'll now come back to our panelists.
Samson, please go ahead.
Please.
Yeah, good afternoon from Ghana.
Good afternoon.
What I want to share with us is how do we make African-led research visible and consumable to the society to solve problems. One thing I have observed in Ghana is most researchers go for clearance and permissions in communities to conduct research. But when we want to share these research findings, it is usually done at conferences, high-level conferences, which is far away from the local and the basic consumers of the problems. And so if we can now be intentional as to how to share the research findings with the local communities from where we have done the research, and make it consumable and visible to them to understand the issues on the ground, how they can contribute to it, how they can get involved with the researchers to solve the problems locally as we wait for government and institutions to come on board. I think this will help us. I have one experience in my school community where we did a brief research on continuous professional development for teachers. Though it was difficult for us to get the permission, and we had to work on a condition that we're not going to expose the officers in the directorate. Sharing the findings with them became another challenge. How the education directorate will be freely available for us to share the findings with them was also a challenge. Who was going to fund the sitting, the snack, the water, and co. But finally, when we were able to share this with them, they quickly realized what was getting wrong in the classrooms, and they started some actions before that district director left the scene. I think this is one way we can start sharing the findings, and it will help for us from the local community. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for your insight. Those were not questions, but rather great conversation and feedback. I mean, in terms of how we can ensure visibility with your experience. Professor Jacqueline, I can come back to you. Thank you. If you remember the question.
Yes, I think Rose had two questions, and thank you very much, Rose, for raising that. I do agree with you that the asymmetries in partnerships will always remain unless you're contributing equally or near equally to the conversation, to the activities of research and all that. So funding is the problem, and just emphasizing that unless we as African institutions, as African leaders, as African organizations actually do put in or invest in research, then the asymmetries will remain, and perhaps years to come, and I'm hoping that will not be the case. We'll still be talking about the differences and the inequalities that exist. So to democratize, perhaps just another version of looking at decolonizing, to democratize that, if we are democratizing research, activities, if we are democratizing the agenda setting, and we are democratizing even the communication of that research, then we've got also to democratize funding itself, so that we don't expect funding to come from one source, but then we have plurality in terms of the epistemologies and everything that follows. So that imbalance will stay, and of course funding, if we keep up, would also give us that advantage. Then there was also the part of how do you engage when you when you have a collaborative engagement, and you're not all going to be of the same expertise, of the same level, or from the same backgrounds in a room engaging. So what makes it an engagement that would give results is an engagement that will bring all hierarchies, different levels of participants to the table. So the differences will always be there. And you cannot erase the fact that I know whom I'm seated with. If I'm seated with the Minister of Education, for instance, I know my place, and so is my student. And so those things will always come on board. So what we've done in the past in terms of trying to get this off the table, you just need to think about the methodologies to engage. If you sit in a room and you want everyone to volunteer, for instance, to comment or to give a contribution to the question that you have, there are those who would contribute because they feel confident, they feel knowledgeable, and there are those who will always feel that they are not as knowledgeable, they will not contribute. So if you're, for instance, moderating in a room, let us say in a focus group discussion, how do you apportion the space for everyone to speak? So sometimes you're actually forced to go around the table. So it's not a question where I volunteer to answer, but everyone else should say something. And that's something. It's not about that. It shouldn't end there. When you're making the presentation of follow-ups, you are most likely as a researcher, or because again of this power plays, you probably want to reference the senior expert in the room. So then you have the quotes in a presentation, the next presentation you have. And if I don't see my point, and I know I'm a student, or I know that my voice is not at that level, then so how do you balance that so that then everything that is said, every comment, every contribution matters? It will matter the way you give that opportunity, and also the way you treat what has been contributed, be it reinforcement just immediately, but also even follow-ups in the reports and all that. How do you do that? There are also forums where you might actually be forced to just give your point anonymously, have stickers. They are all similar in color. I wouldn't know your handwriting. Just say, write what it is that you feel should go into this. So you can have a mix of all this so that you get the voices of everyone. We're not saying that it's going to be 100%, but it will give some leverage so that if I feel shy to speak before my professors or before the senior government official, at least I can write, and I don't have to be shy about that. So or you can have individual conversations where it doesn't have to be in the open. So can we have follow-up discussions? I think your point was good. Can I talk to you maybe during a break time so that then you get to converse? So you can have a range of ways to get these voices. But as I said, it's not just the range of getting the voices, but how you treat that is what will make speak next or not speak next. Because what do you highlight after that? Do you just compliment, highlight, and pick up the points that came from the senior guys in the room and not the others? So all that would go into play. I think I can go on and on in that.
Yeah, I know, Prof. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Great conversation. It's clear that 2 hours is not enough for this great forum. And in fact, 45 minutes for the panel is not quite enough. So next time, there's always a next time, I can promise you. I want the team in the webinar, our delegates, to write in the chat what gives you hope that localization is becoming possible. Please write in the chat, because we cannot all speak in this great. I know we are 180 something. What gives you hope that localization is becoming possible? And I would like to go back to the panelists. The time is finished, but I want to give you half a minute, not even a minute. Tell us, it's clear that we are not lacking evidence. However, we lack system that recognize and use local evidence. In one sentence or less, please, we can start with Dr. Bruno. What can you give as the key message before you leave? Bruno?
Oui, je suis là. Oui, merci beaucoup. Donc, comme message clé, je voudrais quand même suggérer qu'on puisse vraiment aller vers d'abord une recherche vraiment contextualisée, c'est-à-dire qui prend en compte nos réalités socio-africaines, c'est-à-dire considérant les langues, les systèmes éducatifs locaux et surtout l'implication de la communauté. Parce qu'on ne peut pas avoir un système éducatif pour la communauté sans impliquer la communauté. Donc, la communauté, pour moi, devient le premier acteur même avant les bailleurs même, parce que s'il y a le financement et qu'il n'y a pas les acteurs ou bien les parties prenantes à ces projets, donc ça peut pas aboutir. au-delà donc de cette recherche contextualisée, il y a cette recherche encore que je disais tout à l'heure collaborative, mais également qui doit servir à un développement socio-économique donc de l'Afrique. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Bruno. As we said in French, and merci. We can go to Professor Tumbo in less than a minute. What's your key parting message?
Muito obrigado. Uma conversa tão interessante. Eu iria trazer aqui uma reflexão para os que estão a fazer a gestão da área de educação, no Ministério da Educação, às universidades, que todas as suas ações devem estar viradas a um diagnóstico. Não é funcionar trazermos teorias para a comunidade sem que haja um processo de um diagnóstico, não é? Temos que diagnosticar quais são as necessidades de aprendizagem dos educantes. Aí vamos ver que o processo educativo ele vai ser tão atrativo, eles vão gostar. E também quais são as necessidades do professor, não é? Em termos pedagógicos, em termos técnicos, quais são as necessidades? Não os ministérios ou instituições de formação de professores ou as universidades desenhar currículos ou currículos para submeter este. É importante ver quais são as necessidades desses professores para eles poderem trabalhar como deve ser. Então, aos gestores também das universidades, o apelo é o mesmo, e voltar a frisar que temos que abandonar os aspectos decoloniais, ajustar a nossa teoria e prática de investigação ao contexto africano. Muito obrigado.
Thank you. Thank you so much. The key message is we need to diagnose our elephant in the room. Thank you so much. Prof. Helen, in a sentence or less. Thank you.
Again, Lila, one of the issues I would like to flag out is the issue of co-creation being a non-negotiable. We really have to co-create the research agenda with government, co-create it with all the communities that are involved, and that should be combined with mentorship and capacity strengthening of the various teams we work with, so that at the end of the day, even the list of the team is able to articulate the ideas of the research very easily. And last and most importantly, that we take all the research into policy relevant messaging that is tailored to the different clientele that we work with, going back to the community to share our research agenda. So co-creation, capacity strengthening, mentorship, and then translation products that are meaningful to different clientele. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. And lastly, Prof. Jacqueline, in a sentence or less. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mine is to appreciate that you have opened up this conversation. The topic of the day, localizing education research, is really quite key. And to also acknowledge the fact that we can only think about localization if, for instance, we want to achieve equity in terms of bringing out our context. We shouldn't assume that we have all we are all coming from the same context, fitting in the same theories, but having I would say multiple ways of looking at things and ensuring that every learner, every community is served by our research really is through getting the local knowledge out there and also understanding the differences that we experience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Jackie. Thank you so much, Prof. Helen, Professor Florencio, and Dr. Bruno. We really appreciate your time and your support and this great conversation, and also the delegates in the room, the webinar team members in the room. This is very important. As you said, we have just started. The finding we just presented have just come in. we are going to continue with this conversation. I want to send it back to Davis, just to note that we have handled the panel and the Q&A together, if you have realized, and the question can still come in through the chat. We will try to respond, but just to note that this is just the beginning. We'll continue with this great conversation forum as it's needed. Thank you so much. Over to you, Davis.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Dr. Leila and our panelists. Indeed, we have just started. And to keep with the momentum, I want to welcome Professor Auer, who is the Inspector General of Programs, Teaching Methods and Training at the Ministry of Youth Affairs and Civic Education and former technical advisor to the minister, a multidisciplinary scholar with a PhD in medical anthropology from Newcastle University. His work bridges education, governance, youth empowerment, and African-centered knowledge systems with a strong expertise in evidence-based policymaking, institutional capacity strengthening, and strategic communication across public and private sectors. So if Prof. Auer can hear me and you're ready, please tell us who is responsible when education research is not used in about 7 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Davis, for giving me the floor. First of all, I want to thank thank you as moderator, the panelists, the colleagues, researchers, and policymakers, development partners, and every other person that is connected to this webinar. Good afternoon to everyone. I would like to commend ESSA and APHRC for convening this timely and important conversation on localizing education research in Africa for equity and inclusion. The discussion today, discussions today have rightly highlighted critical issues: epistemic exclusion, unequal partnership, external funding dependency, and the disconnection between research production and policy implementation. These are realities many of us encounter daily across Africa education systems. However, I would like to contribute to a perspective that is, in my view, remains insufficiently explored in our conversation on localization. When Stephen presented, he showed to us towards the end the decolonization toolkit. And the toolkit showed one of the items being that of accountability. When Amani did his presentation, he talked about Ubuntu. These two, the accountability and Ubuntu are the same thing, they are accountability. So my perspective would be accountability going beyond sharing the research findings with research participants after research. So, but you'll find out that the problem of Africa is not producing local research or strengthening partnership, bridging evidence and policy, but it addresses accountability mechanisms. So my intervention focuses on one central question: who is accountable when research is not used? Across Africa, we are witnessing a steady growth in locally generated research. All of us are researchers here in one way or the other. So universities are producing more scholars. Research institutions are expanding. Civil society organizations are generating evidence from communities, as we just heard the speakers talk. Government is increasingly speaking the language of data, innovation, and evidence-based policy making. Yet, despite this progress, a persistent gap remains between evidence generation and policy action. In many cases, excellent research exists, but policies continue to be shaped by political expediency, donor conditionalities, as we have heard, institutional inertia, and fragmented governance systems. We therefore face a paradox in Africa, which is that Africa is producing more knowledge than we ever had before, but much of that knowledge still struggles to influence decisions on meaningful and sustained ways. This suggests that the challenge before us is no longer only a problem of research production. It is increasing a problem of governance and accountability. Much of the current localization agenda focuses on important priorities. We know that research exists, but it is not. Policies are made without evidence, and donor priorities override national needs. So go to the next slide, please. So much of current localization agenda focuses on important priorities like strengthening African research capacity, promoting equitable partnership, increasing indigenous knowledge systems, improving financing, and supporting early career researchers. Our concern here is these are essential reforms, but localization cannot end with the production of African knowledge. It must also address the structures that determine whether the knowledge is actually used. So localization without accountability risks becoming symbolic rather than transformational. And I will explain further as we go ahead. At present, very few systems across our education sector ask critical accountability questions such as, was available evidence considered before this policy was adopted? If evidence existed and was ignored, why? Who bears responsibility when ineffective or non-evidence-based interventions fail? How do we measure the uptake of research within ministries, universities, and development programs? In many of our countries in Africa, we have strong financial accountability systems. We audit budgets, procure processes, and expenditures, but we rarely have what I would call epistemic accountability. That is accountability for how knowledge and evidence are integrated into public decision-making. Because here we have the evidence, but is it integrated into the public decision-making process? So this is where I believe the localization agenda must evolve. Otherwise, we risk creating a system where African researchers produce knowledge that remains academically celebrated through publications, through promotions, and so on, but institutionally ignored. So one of the dangers we must avoid is having a system where we have symbolic localization. That's what we want to avoid from this research. And symbolic localizations occurs when African participation increases, but power over decisions remain unchanged. It occurs when local researchers are consulted, like we are doing the research, will be consulted, but not listened to. It occurs when reports are commissioned but never implemented. And it occurs when evidence becomes a procedural requirement rather than a driver of transformation. So we are talking about localizing education research, but education research that is transformative, that will transform our societies. And to move beyond symbolic localization, we need to institutionalize evidence use within governance system. Go to the next slide, please. So here you find that those who are responsible for making sure that accountability is not achieved. And these are the same people who are responsible to make sure that it is attained. Government, donors, researchers, and CSOs or LGs. So here, I have a few things that I will say. We were talking about alignment. So we are aligning by moving from evidence to action. So we need to act. Evidence, a lot of evidence is produced, but we need to act on that evidence. So go to the next slide, please. How can we do that? We have identified the problem. Many African countries have education sector reviews, research reports, data systems, but policies are sometimes politically driven, not evidence driven. So research uptake is optional, not mandatory. But from what we are talking about, accountability, it needs to become mandatory. Go to the next slide, please. And secondly, we need to introduce the gaps. There is no structured accountability framework in our systems. So we need to track whether research research informs decisions, evaluates ministries on evidence use, and requires justification when evidence is ignored. And that takes us back to the toolkit that Stephen presented. Go to the next please. So the third way we can develop accountability framework is proposing solutions where evidence use audits the ministries of education. We need to set up an audit system and indicators that will show us that a particular research has been integrated into the policy. We have to integrate research uptake into sector performance reviews, education plans, and then creation of evidence accountability scorecards, where we are able to do scoring that provides milestones that have been attained from the basis of education research. And of course, we need parliamentary and public oversight on whether policies are evidence informed. Go to the next slide, please.
Prof, you have about 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. So now we have anti-corruption frameworks already tracked. We have financial accountability in our systems, but we lack epistemic accountability. So accountability for how knowledge is used. But we are talking about epistemic accountability. Go to the next place. So we need to do a linking of localization to ownership and accountability. So I would say that if localization is about ownership, then accountability must follow ownership. If we just have ownership and we are not accountable, then we can't achieve our goals. Otherwise, we risk producing more African research that still does not shape African decisions. Next. So, distinguished participants, Africans do not suffer from a complete absence of ideas or evidence. In many instances, we already know what works. The real challenge is ensuring that this knowledge consistently shapes action. And this is why accountability matters, epistemic accountability. So at this point, let us move from asking only who produces knowledge to also asking who uses it, who benefits from it, and who is responsible when it is ignored. When we produce knowledge and it is ignored, it is because there's the lack of epistemic accountability. So in conclusion, I would say localization without accountability risks becoming a symbolic rather than transformational. But localization with accountability can strengthen institutional trust, improve policy effectiveness, and ultimately help us build education systems that are not only African in context, but also equitable, inclusive, and responsible to the realities of our people. Thank you very much for listening.
Great. Thank you, Prof, for that. Indeed, localization without accountability risk becoming symbolic rather than transformational. Thank you very much for such an insightful session. Now, as we come to the tail end of this webinar, I would want to recognize one particular person or representative. I'm not so sure if Dr. Hamadu, you're on the call from IDRC. As we try and get hold of you, please let me also welcome my colleague from ESSA, Dr. Samuel Asare, who will be taking us through the summary and, of course, the next steps and the key takeaways as we wait to, after Dr. Asare, we will then see if Dr. Amadu from IDRC is around and he can give us a word or two so that we come to the end of this webinar. But Dr. Samuel Asare is the Senior Research Manager at the Education Sub-Saharan Africa and an Associate Member of the Research for Equitable Access and Learning Center. His work focuses on advancing the use of African data and evidence to improve early childhood development outcomes through research grants, capacity strengthening, and policy-relevant research, while also examining how international funding structures and local systematic barriers affect equitable education research and knowledge production across Africa. Welcome, Dr. Asare. Please take it away.
Yeah, thank you very much, Davis. I mean, I've been following the discussion. It has been so enriching and insightful. So I was just asking myself, how do I summarize all these insightful conversations and present key takeaways? But yes, I will try. Yeah, so I mean, from the onset, we've had a conversation around what we mean by localizing education research and why does it matter. We've also looked at the synthesis around barriers and reforms for local education research. There have been conversations around environmental scan, empirical insights from Kenya. Also a wonderful panel discussing from evidence to action pathways for localization. Very, very interesting and engaging Q&A and plenary discussions. And also, finally, we heard from Professor Awao on localizing accountability. So, I mean, from listening to all these conversations and presentations, there are a few things that stood up for me. I mean, the first one is around localizing education research matters because it draws on rigorous evidence generation based on African value systems for local and global decision making. So all what we are saying is that, yeah, we need to not only acknowledge what is done elsewhere. It's important, but it's also very important to draw on our own way of knowing and understand our problems and issues and the solutions that we can generate from within. It's also key to note that we are not saying localization means rejecting external knowledge. What we are saying is that adapting and incorporating what has been found elsewhere to help us address our issues. So what's where issues around test space came in. So drawing on different ways of knowing, bringing different ideas, bringing different information into the basket. So we have a bigger and better understanding of the issues and the solutions that we require. I mean, there was also a point around the practices for local education research ecosystem already exist and need to be connected and institutionalized. That's when we are looking at collaboration. So there are a lot of good things happening. There are researchers that are pushing for African learning. There are donors. This event is being sponsored by a donor. It means that they actually believe in this kind of approach. And there are other donors that are also doing same. And there are institutions pushing for this. So yeah, there are a lot of good practices around. So the issue is around identifying these and then connecting them together. So we will have a better understanding of the issues to be able to address the problem that confront us. Professor Allah was talking about localizing accountability, especially accountability for how knowledge is used. And I think that goes to all of us, because if a policymaker will use knowledge, it means they have been engaged. The research speaks to the realities, their priorities, the elephant. That is when they will use the evidence. So, I mean, this comes to a meaningful engagement that some of the speakers spoke about. Engaging policymakers, engaging communities, engaging teachers, practitioners to identify the elephant and to make sure that we address the problem that actually we say is a felt problem, the priorities of the end user. There's also a issue around funding. Localizing education research is intertwined with funding, especially local sources of funding, because if you want to pursue our agenda as an African, definitely we need to invest. We need to make sure governments invest in education research. I mean, the evidence around AU's kind of projection of 1% of GDP towards research and development. You know, I think a lot of government haven't been able to meet this commitment. So if you want to own our agenda, it's not just localizing or decolonizing. We also need to decolonize the funding sources. We need to make sure we invest in this space, so we'll be able to invest in our own priority areas. So issues around local evidence becomes meaningful only when it's connected to policy decision-making power. So what I mean, and so what all the research you conduct, publishing in international journals and all of that. So what to what end? Yes, for your promotion, for knowledge of its own sake. But at the end of the day, we need to change practice. We need to change policy. We need to make sure that marginalized people, children benefit from the knowledge that we produce. And so we're also talking about how do we make sure that the knowledge we produce are translated in a way that will promote uptake and to benefit, especially the communities where we collect the data from. We're also looking at localizing. Localization must be country and context specific, as systems differ across countries. We heard from the presentation by Josh looking at Mozambique, Kenya, and Senegal, where these three countries differ. Of course, there are similarities, but there are also sharp differences in terms of the education system. So as long as we are localizing, even within country, there might be areas we have to be very cautious in terms of how we apply what we know elsewhere to a different context. So we need to understand the context and have it in our mind that there are differences, and these differences need to be taken into consideration. So, and overall, localizing education research in Africa is an ongoing project requiring critical reflections of stakeholders in the research process. So in agenda setting, researchers need to ask questions. Whose agenda? Funders need to ask questions. This project I'm putting funding into, I mean, whose agenda? Have I engaged the local people? Are their voices incorporated in this? So that's something we need to look at. As a reflection that all actors need to engage. Partnerships and governance. Who are the partners? What is the governance structure? Do we have people with disabilities? How about women? What about early career researchers? In terms of research presentation, implementation, communication for uptake, are we only writing for peer review, journal publication? Have you considered, for example, policy briefs? How about community kind of engagement? Have we also incorporated kind of sharing the findings in the communities where we collected the data, so they will be able to also use the evidence? Have you considered teachers, school leaders? Are they find this or the data in a way that is accessible to these various audiences? So yeah, it's been very insightful. I'm so excited that I got the opportunity to share these reflections and key takeaways. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Asare, for summarizing the entire conversation. And clearly, as we have been, hearing, 2 hours is not enough to exhaust it all. So thank you so much. Let's keep the conversation going. At this point, I am being informed that Dr. Amidu might have stepped away, but nevertheless, we are grateful for the partnership with IDRC. And at this juncture, I want to welcome back my colleague, Dr. Leila, to give us the closing remarks and perhaps maybe what we will receive after this webinar. Thank you. My name has been Davis Musyoki. I was today's moderator. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Leila.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Davis. A big clap to Mr. Davis. It has been a very hard time to manage this great conversation. You can imagine we are past the hour, but I mean, what to say? As you said, sometimes it's easy to sacrifice a little bit time. Please, in your chat, we have an evaluation form. It's great to hear feedback because we want to continue the conversation, and you will see a question on how do we continue with this? What next? What emerging topic do you foresee us moving on together with this? On behalf of our partnership relationship team members, APHRC and ESSA and other colleagues on board, as you saw, we have a number of experts, our panelists as well. We want to say thank you, our delegates, our crew behind the scene. We have our expert communication team members. We want to say thanks to everybody, and we appreciate your time. And we promise you this is not the end. At the end of it, we'll share the recordings as needed, and we'll also share findings and reports when it comes out. As soon as it comes out, we'll use this emailing list to share these great findings as we try to keep our small learning forum in this engagement. So I want to say thank you all, and without further ado, enjoy your day further. If it's evening, good evening. If it's a good afternoon where you sit, and we hope to see you very soon. Enjoy. Bye-bye.
Good morning, good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Bye.